You may have heard that Enlightenment deists believed in a watchmaker god, that is, a god who created the world and then left it to run on its own, the same way a watchmaker creates a watch and then lets it run on its own. I want to share with you what I found out about the deists of the 16 and 1700s after reading thousands of their books and pamphlets. I found out the deists did not believe in a watchmaker god because they thought the god was actively involved in worldly events. Moreover, unlike the Christians of their time, the deists thought God was a kind and loving parent who was always good to everyone. In the 16 and 1700s, Christians were such bullies that they often tortured, imprisoned, whipped, and hanged anyone who disagreed with Christianity. Deists like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Paine were the only people who were brave enough to stand up to the Christian authorities and say that God did not want people to follow a bunch of rules written in the Bible, or rules made up by the Catholic Church. Most people misunderstand deism because they think deism was a response to Isaac Newton's new scientific worldview, a worldview which supposedly taught that God was inactive once he created the world and its laws. But this idea is mistaken for two reasons. First, because, as scholars have shown, Newtonian scientists did not believe God was inactive. Plus, the first book about deism was written 60 years earlier than Newton's famous scientific book. Herbert of Cherbury, the author of the first book about deism, was not responding to earlier parts of the scientific revolution, like the discoveries of Galileo and Kepler, as Herbert did not care much about scientific discoveries. In fact, he still believed in astrology and even praised the ancient art of divination, which is telling the future by various methods, including looking at the entrails of birds. Herbert was responding to the Christianity of his time, which believed that God was so controlling and cruel that he only let Christians into heaven. This God also doomed everyone else to an eternity in hell, even if they'd never heard of Jesus and were good people who always tipped 20% and picked up hitchhikers. Herbert thought a kind and fair God must have given a way for every good person to get into heaven. Herbert turned to Stoicism and its belief that everyone was born with certain ideas already put into their minds by God. Herbert thought that God had put 5 principles in everyone's mind, telling people that God existed and that if they loved God and were good to other people, then they would be rewarded after they died. Later deists shared this basic view of a caring and kind God who let everyone into heaven if they loved God and were good. On the other hand, Christians of the 16 and 1700s still saw God as cruel and wrathful, just like he is portrayed in the Bible's Old Testament. The Christians believed God was so needy and controlling that if people did not obey all his rules, he would severely punish them with plagues and fires, just like he had punished Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. For example, in 1665, John Tillotson believed that because the English government had allowed the heresy of Catholicism, God afflicted the English with the Great Plague of London. Tillotson also thought the Great Fire of 1666 was caused by God because the English government still had not banished Catholicism from England. It was not just leading Christian ministers who believed this. So too did prominent scientists. In 1720, the bubonic plague was ravaging southern France. Samuel Clarke, a leading English mathematician, thought God would send the plague into England unless all the English people repented for their sins. The deists thought God was too good and fair to be so cruel. When the deists stood up for this loving and kind God, the Christian authorities were quick to call them heretics and blasphemers, and sometimes to punish them. For example, in 1762, when Peter Annett wrote that Moses had faked his miracles, he was tortured in the pillory and had to spend a year in prison at hard labor. In 1813, Daniel Isaac Eaton was arrested for merely selling a deist book and was sentenced to a year in Newgate prison, as well as time in the stocks. Scholars think deism was a movement based on intellectual ideas that were popular in the Enlightenment period. So deism basically died when the Enlightenment ended around the beginning of the 1800s. Most scholars believe that as science moved on in the 1800s, people who would earlier have become deists became atheists and agnostics. But deism was more than an intellectual movement based on Enlightenment ideas. It was a spiritual movement based on a view of God as good and caring to everyone. After the Enlightenment ended, many people still believed that God was good and not like the wrathful and cruel God of the Bible's Old Testament. I end my book by showing that two sociologists, Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton, think a form of deism is still very much alive in America. Based on an in-depth survey, these two sociologists state that the most popular spiritual or religious outlook among contemporary Americans is a deistic spiritual outlook. God exists. God wants people to be good. God wants people to be happy, and finally people are good, go to heaven after they die. These two sociologists label this spiritual outlook moralistic therapeutic deism. Many social observers agree with the two sociologists that moralistic therapeutic deism is very popular in contemporary America. Most interestingly, many Christian leaders agree that American Christians believe this too. For example, Albert Mohler said that moralistic therapeutic deism appears to characterize the beliefs of vast millions of Americans, both young and old. A Catholic church in Michigan even believes this kind of deism is so widespread that the church has asked its members to say a daily prayer to stop its growth. My book shows that deism was historically a very important movement. The deists were the first modern people who were spiritual but not religious. In fact, by being the first important group to fight against Christian control of Western society, they made it possible for people in many Western societies to escape Christian control and be spiritual but not religious. Many important American founders were also deists, and deism contributed to the development of liberal Protestantism, the major Protestant alternative to fundamentalism and evangelicism. Moreover, deism is not some relic of the 16 and 1700s that only a few people believe in. It is very much alive and doing well, and is an alternative to traditional religious beliefs that you might find appealing. If you want to know more about deism, you can read the first chapter of my book at Google and Amazon.